I've always believed that when you buy a house, you should have the freedom to live in it the way you want, as long as you're not hurting anyone. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know that they don't exactly see it that way. They think they own not just the streets, not just the lawns, but your very life. And in my case, they thought they had the right to tell me how many people I could have over at my own home. It all started when my family began using my house as the go-to spot for gatherings. I've got a decent backyard, a grill, and enough space for people to stretch out, laugh, and have a good time. I don't throw wild parties. I don't have people parking all over the street. Most of the time, it's just family, my siblings, their kids, my parents, and the occasional neighbor who joins in for a burger. But apparently, according to the HOA, that was too many guests. Now, the first time they came at me with this nonsense, I laughed. I thought it was some kind of joke. They sent me a formal letter saying I was in violation of the community rules because I had excessive foot traffic and unauthorized gatherings. They even had the nerve to attach a blurry photo of my driveway, where you could see maybe 5 cars parked. 5. That was their definition of too many. I ignored the first letter. I figured they had better things to do, or maybe someone on the board was just in a bad mood that day. But no. A week later, I got another letter, this time with a fine. They wanted me to pay $200 for hosting unauthorized social gatherings. I nearly spit out my coffee reading it. $200 for letting my mom, my brother, and a couple of cousins come over for a barbecue. That's when I realized this wasn't going away. The HOA president lets call her Karen because, trust me, she was the very definition of a Karen was on some kind of mission to make an example out of me. She lived 3 houses down, in the kind of place where the blinds are always twitching, where she knows every single detail about who drives where and what time your trash cans go out. She had been gunning for me ever since I moved in. The funny thing is, before this whole too many guests fiasco, she had already complained about my lawn being too natural. I had planted wildflowers, and apparently that was a crime, against the community's sense of order. Then she didn't like the color I painted my front door too bold, she said. And now, apparently, me enjoying the company of my own family was an issue. At first, I tried the reasonable approach. I showed up at the next HOA meeting. It was in the community clubhouse, and, as usual, it was attended by maybe 6 people total. I raised my hand, asked politely what exactly the rule was regarding guests. They fumbled around in their papers, trying to look official. And finally, Karen said, "It falls under the nuisance section." Nuisance. I asked, "Having my family over is a nuisance?" She gave me that condescending smile that people like her are born with. "We've had complaints," she said. "From who?" I wanted to know. She wouldn't say, just neighbors, which, as I looked around the room, meant herself. That's when I started to realize that this wasn't just about me. This was about control. Karen thrived on it. She wasn't happy unless she was dictating every little thing in the neighborhood. And now, she was trying to dictate who could step foot on my property. I went home that night angry, but also determined. I pulled out the HOA's official bylaws, the thick packet of rules they give you when you move in. I went through it page by page, highlighter in hand, looking for any mention of guest limits. Nothing. They had rules about fence height, paint colors, even where your garbage bins could be seen from the street, but nowhere did it say how many guests you could have. So the next time they tried to find me, I wrote back with a copy of their own bylaws highlighted, pointing out that they were inventing rules. I thought that would shut them down. Instead, Karen doubled down. She sent another letter, this one accusing me of misinterpreting the bylaws. Apparently, I wasn't qualified to read words on a page unless the HOA approved of my reading. And here's where things started to get interesting. The more they pushed, the more I started noticing something. Karen and her fellow board members were the biggest hypocrites in the neighborhood. They were constantly hosting get-togethers. Every Friday night, I'd see a parade of cars outside her house. They'd have wine nights, poker games, even outdoor barbecues bigger than anything I'd ever hosted. But because it was them, it wasn't a nuisance. It was community building. I started documenting everything: photos, notes, times, dates. Every time they had more than 3 cars outside, I wrote it down. Every time loud music carried down the street from Karen's backyard, I noted it. If I was going to war with the HOA, I was going to have receipts. Then came the twist of fate. I found out that the HOA had their annual meeting coming up. It was supposed to be in the community center, like always. That's when the idea hit me. If they want to play games about gatherings, maybe it was time I hosted a gathering of my own. See, the bylaws had one little clause that Karen must have overlooked. It stated that any homeowner could host an official HOA meeting as long as notice was given in writing and the majority of board members agreed. All I had to do was file the paperwork before they did, and guess what? I did. I reserved my own backyard as the location for the annual HOA meeting. I sent out the notices, perfectly legal and perfectly within their own rules. And once it was locked in, there was nothing they could do to stop it. The morning of the annual HOA meeting, I woke up before the sun. I was too wired to sleep, pacing my living room with a mug of coffee in my hand, staring out at the yard I'd transformed into an event space. Rows of folding chairs I'd rented from a local party supply shop sat neatly arranged on the grass. A long folding table held pitchers of water, cups, and a plate of cookies. My mom insisted on baking for the occasion. At the center of it all stood a simple wooden podium I'd borrowed from the community school, complete with a microphone I'd wired into my outdoor speakers. It looked professional. It looked organized. And best of all, it looked like I was dead serious. The thing about dealing with people like Karen and her little HOA squad is that they thrive on intimidation. They want you to feel small, like you don't have the right to question them. But I wasn't about to cower. If they wanted to drag me into their world of rules and technicalities, then I'd use their own rules to flip the script. Neighbors started trickling over well before the official start time. First, it was Jim and his wife from 2 houses down. Jim was carrying his own lawn chair because he didn't trust the folding ones. Then came Alyssa, who lived across the street. She had a tray of lemonade and a grin that told me she was here for the show. By the time 9 o'clock rolled around, I had more people in my backyard than the HOA had ever managed to get at their regular meetings. It was almost funny. The same neighbors who never bothered to show up to the clubhouse were suddenly out, in full force, curious to see what this backyard HOA meeting was all about. And the best part? Every single one of them was here legally, because I had followed the bylaws to the letter. At exactly 9:15, they arrived. Karen, flanked by 2 of her loyal board members, marched up the driveway like she was leading a military parade. She was dressed in her usual power outfit: pressed slacks, a button-up blouse, and that smug expression she never left home without. In her hand was a folder stuffed with papers, which I assumed were copies of my so-called violations. "Good morning, Karen," I said, with the friendliest smile I could muster. "Welcome to my home." She didn't return the smile. "This is highly irregular," she snapped. "The annual meeting is supposed to be held in the community center, not according to your own bylaws," I replied, holding up my copy of the rule book. Section 8, Paragraph 3. Any homeowner may serve as host of the annual meeting, provided notice is given in writing and a majority of board members are informed, which I did. 2 weeks ago, you got the letter. Her face tightened. I could see the muscle in her jaw twitching. She had gotten the letter, of course, but she hadn't thought I'd actually go through with it. She thought she could brush me off, maybe intimidate me into canceling. Too late for that. The chairs were filled, the neighbors were chatting, and the meeting was about to begin whether she liked it or not. Karen tried to argue. She pulled out her papers, waving them around like they were holy scripture. This isn't an appropriate venue. This is a backyard. This is perfectly legitimate. I cut in smoothly. Besides, don't you think it's fitting? Since you've been so concerned about the number of guests I have at my house, now you get to see just how many people my yard can hold. That got a laugh from the crowd. Neighbors clapped, some whistled, and Karen's cheeks flushed red. She hated being laughed at almost as much as she hated losing control. Once everyone was seated, I stepped up to the podium and tapped the mic. All right, folks, let's get started. Welcome to the 7th annual meeting of our community HOA. For the first time ever, it's being hosted right here in my backyard. That got another round of chuckles and applause. The mood was light, but underneath it, there was a current of tension. Everyone knew why we were here. Everyone knew about the fines, the complaints, the ridiculous too many guests accusation. And everyone was waiting to see how this showdown was going to play out. Karen tried to take control, of course. As president of the HOA, she began, stepping toward the podium, I will be conducting this meeting as usual. Actually, I said, blocking her path with a polite but firm smile. Since I'm the host, I'll be conducting the meeting this time. You'll get your turn, don't worry. The gasps from the crowd were audible. No one had ever talked to her that way. She froze in place, blinking at me like I'd just slapped her with a fish. But there was nothing she could do. The rule book was on my side, and she knew it, so I started. I went through the agenda just like any HOA meeting. Financial updates, maintenance reports, upcoming projects. Only this time, I had actual neighbors participating. They asked questions, they voiced concerns, they laughed and shared stories. It felt less like a meeting and more like a community gathering the way it should have been all along. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The floor opened for member issues, and I stepped aside to let Karen take the podium. She stormed up, gripping the edges like she was about to crush it with her bare hands. She launched straight into it. We have had multiple complaints about one homeowner hosting unauthorized gatherings with far too many guests, creating excessive noise and congestion in the neighborhood. This is a clear violation of I raised my hand. Excuse me, Karen? Could you point to the specific bylaw that limits the number of guests? She faltered. The crowd was silent, waiting. She flipped through her papers, pretending to search. But I knew there was nothing there. Section 12, Nuisance Clause, she finally said weakly. Ah, the Nuisance Clause? I said, nodding. The one that's so vague it could mean anything? From playing music too loud to having a squeaky gate. Funny thing about that, clauset's also the same one that would apply to, say, weekly poker nights at your house with 10 cars parked on the street, wouldn't it? The neighbors murmured, heads turned. Everyone had seen the parade of vehicles at her place. Everyone knew she was guilty of the same violations she was accusing me of. I pulled out my notebook and flipped it open. For the record. I continued. On March 5th, I counted 11 cars outside your home. On March 19th, 13. April 2nd, 9. And let's not forget the barbecue you hosted on Memorial Day, 23 guests, according to my photos. The murmurs turned into laughter. Karen's face went crimson. She opened her mouth to argue, but the crowd drowned her out with jeers and chuckles. It was in that moment I realized I wasn't just defending myself. I was pulling back the curtain on the entire HOA's hypocrisy. Karen wasn't interested in fairness or community. She was interested in control. And now, in front of everyone, she was losing it. The air in my backyard felt electric after Karen stormed away from the podium. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some chuckling, others shaking their heads. The woman who usually silenced entire rooms with a single glare had just been called out, And for once, nobody was afraid to laugh at her. I stood at the podium, letting the moment stretch. I didn't rush it. I wanted everyone to feel the weight of what had just happened. Then, I leaned into the microphone. "Well," I said with a grin, "I guess that clears things up about who really has too many guests." The laughter exploded. It wasn't cruel, more of a communal release, like everyone had been holding in their frustration with the HOA for years, and now they finally had permission to let it out. I glanced over at Karen. She was sitting stiffly in her folding chair, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they were practically invisible. Her fellow board members shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly unsure whether to defend her or keep their heads down. "Let's move on, shall we?" I continued, flipping my notebook shut. "Member concerns? Anyone here have something they'd like to bring up about the way our HOA has been operating?" At first, there was silence. People looked around, hesitant. After all, the HOA board had been running unchecked for years, and most neighbors had learned to stay quiet rather than risk becoming the next target. But slowly, one brave soul raised his hand. It was Jim, my next-door neighbor with the trusty lawn chair. He stood up, cleared his throat, and said, "Yeah, I've got something. Why are our dues going up every year, but the pool hasn't been?" Resurfaced in over a decade, the crowd murmured in agreement. That pool was a sore subject. The plaster was cracked, the tiles were missing, and the water always looked murky, no matter how much chlorine they dumped into it. Karen opened her mouth to respond. Ty quickly held up a hand. "Great question, Jim. Let's check the budget. Report." I gestured to the financial statements I'd printed out and handed copies around before the meeting began. According to last year's report, almost half of our annual dues went to administrative expenses. Care to elaborate on that, Karen? Her face turned a deeper shade of red. "Those are necessary costs," she sputtered. "Postage, legal consultations, office supplies, office supplies." Melissa, the woman with the lemonade, cut in. "Why are we paying thousands of dollars for paper clips when we can't even get the potholes on Willow Lane filled?" The murmurs turned into outright grumbles. People started flipping through the handouts, pointing at line items and shaking their heads. For years, nobody had questioned the numbers. Now that they were seeing them in black and white, the truth was impossible to ignore. Karen tried to regain control. "These are complicated matters," she said, her voice growing shriller. "Not everyone here understands the responsibilities of running a homeowners association." "Then explain it," I said smoothly. "That's what this meeting is for, right?" The neighbors clapped again. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone realizing they didn't have to sit quietly while the board made decisions in the dark. One by one, people started speaking up. A mother complained about the outdated playground equipment that had splinters sticking out of it. An elderly couple brought up the broken streetlights that made them feel unsafe walking their dog at night. Someone else mentioned how the HOA kept threatening to fine people for unapproved paint colors. Even when the shades were practically identical to the ones on the approved list, every complaint was met with nods, agreement, and frustration, aimed squarely at the board. Karen sat there, fuming silently, her face a storm cloud. Her allies tried to defend her, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with an umbrella. The more they talked, the angrier the neighbors got. And then came the real twist. A man I didn't recognize stood up near the back. He was tall, with graying hair and a calm, steady presence. He introduced himself as Mark, a homeowner who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. He didn't usually attend meetings, he said, but he'd heard about this one and wanted to see it for himself. "I've been here since this community was built," Mark said. "I remember when the HOA was formed. Back then, it was supposed to be about keeping the neighborhood nice, helping each other out, and making decisions together. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about that. It turned into a power trip. All eyes were on him. Even Karen, for once, was quiet. Mark looked directly at her. "This neighborhood isn't your kingdom. It belongs to all of us. And if the board can't remember that, maybe it's time for a new board." The backyard erupted. People clapped, cheered, even stood up. For the first time in years, someone had spoken the truth out loud. And it was like a spark hitting dry grass. Karen shot to her feet, slamming her hands on her chair. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "You can't just," but her voice was drowned out by the sound of neighbors chanting, "Vote, vote, vote." I couldn't believe it. I had set out to embarrass the HOA, maybe buy myself some breathing room. But what was happening now was bigger than me. The crowd wasn't just fed up with Karen's obsession over my so-called guests. They were fed up with everything. The chants of vote, vote, vote rolled across my backyard like a thunderstorm. Neighbors were clapping, stomping their feet, and raising their voices louder with every repetition. For years, these people had sat in silence while Karen and her board dictated every little thing. Now, in the middle of my backyard, they were demanding change. And I could see in their eyes they weren't going to be silenced again. Karen, however, was not going down without a fight. She raised her arms, trying to wave the crowd down. "This isn't how things are done," she shouted. "We have procedures. Elections aren't held at annual meetings without 30 days' notice, and actually," I said, flipping through the bylaws I had practically memorized, "special elections can be called at an annual meeting if a majority of homeowners present vote in favor of it." Section 14, paragraph 2. The crowd roared in approval. People slapped me on the back, shouted, "He's right," and "Let's do it." Karen's face drained of color. She hadn't expected me to be this prepared. For so long, she had relied on nobody ever reading the rule book. She never thought someone would throw her own words back at her. Mark, the elder homeowner, stood tall at the back of the crowd. "I motion for a vote of no confidence in the current board," he declared. "Let's put it to the people right here, right now." The backyard erupted again. Cheers, applause, people raising their hands in support. Karen's two board allies looked like they wanted to sink into their chairs and disappear. "I second the motion," Melissa added, holding her lemonade cup high like a torch. Karen tried to shout over them, "This is illegitimate. You can't just hold an election in someone's backyard, Karen." Mark cut her off, his calm voice carrying more weight than her shrieking ever could. "It doesn't matter where the meeting is. You agreed to it when you didn't contest the notice. This is the official annual meeting, and you can't stop the majority." Neighbors began raising their hands one by one, some reluctantly, others enthusiastically. I stood at the podium, counting. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just defending myself, was giving people a voice they hadn't had in years. "All in favor of a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board?" I asked into the mic. Hands shot up across the yard. All opposed. A few half-hearted hands, mostly from Karen's inner circle. The result was overwhelming. Nearly every homeowner present voted to oust the board. Karen's face twisted in fury. She slammed her folder down on her lap, muttering curses under her breath. "This is a witch hunt," she spat. "You're all ungrateful. Without me, this neighborhood would fall apart. You'll regret this." But her words carried no weight anymore. The crowd wasn't afraid of her. They were energized, unified, and looking for the next step. Mark raised his hand again. "Then I move, we elect a new board today." The cheers came instantly. "Yes, do it now. We're tired of waiting." Karen tried to storm out, but neighbors blocked the gate. Not aggressively, but firmly. "You're still a homeowner. Here, Jim said. "You have to participate like the rest of us. That's what the rules say." And that's when it hit me. Dozens of pairs of eyes, expectant, hopeful, waiting. I had started this as a personal battle, a way to defend my right to host a barbecue without being fined. But now the neighborhood wanted me to lead. Melissa called out, "I nominate him," and pointed straight at me. He's the only one who stood up to them. Tease, the only one who actually read the bylaws. He should be on the board. The chants started instantly. Him. I raised my hands, trying to calm them down. Hold on. I didn't come here today planning to take over anything. I just wanted to be left alone to live. In my house, in peace. But if you really think I can help make this neighborhood better, then I won't say no. The crowd erupted again. We held the election right there, in the middle of my yard. Mark was nominated as president, Melissa as treasurer, Jim as secretary. And to my shock, they voted me onto the board as vice president. Mitha, guy who just weeks ago was being threatened with fines for too many guests. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to interrupt. "This isn't fair. You can't just push me out like this." Mark looked her square in the eye. "Fair? You fined people for flowers in their garden. You threatened families over paint colors. You tried to ruin a man for having his family. Over. This is the fairest thing that's happened in this neighborhood in years." The vote was unanimous. The old board was dissolved. Karen and her cronies were officially out. The mood turned celebratory after that. Neighbors clapped each other on the back, shook hands, hugged. Some joked that it was the best HOA meeting they'd ever been to Wand, the first one where they felt like they actually mattered. As the crowd began to disperse, I stood there in the yard, exhausted but exhilarated. What had started as a fight for my own rights had turned into something so much bigger. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid. They were hopeful. The days after the backyard meeting felt surreal. My neighbors walked by my house with smiles, waves, and a newfound friendliness that hadn't been there before. People who used to keep their heads down suddenly stopped to chat. Kids played freely in front yards without parents nervously peeking through blinds. It was like a heavy weight had been lifted from the whole neighborhood. But with every smile and handshake, I kept wondering, what about Karen? 'Cause if there's one thing I knew for sure, it was that Karen wasn't the type to simply accept defeat. She might have been voted out of power, but she wasn't done. Not yet. The first sign came a week later. I found an envelope shoved in my mailbox, not mailed, not even properly sealed, just crammed in there. Inside was a handwritten letter, scrawled in Karen's sharp, angry script. "You think you've won," it read, "but I'll be watching. This neighborhood is mine. You won't last." Creepy, definitely surprising. Not at all. I showed the letter to Mark at our first official meeting of the new board, which ironically enough, we held in the same community center Karen had once ruled over. He chuckled. "Don't let her rattle you. People like her thrive on fear. The moment you stop fearing them, they lose their grip." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was plotting something. Sure enough, within another week, rumors started swirling. Karen was knocking on doors, trying to convince people the election had been illegal. She claimed the bylaws had been misinterpreted, that the backyard meeting didn't count, that she was still the rightful HOA president. The problem was, the neighbors weren't buying it. Not anymore. They'd seen her hypocrisy exposed. They'd heard her bluster crumble under the weight of facts. And they'd realized they had more power as a group than she ever did as an individual. When she finally showed up at another meeting storming, in late folder clutched to her chest like a weapon, no body flinched. She stood at the back, demanding to be recognized, demanding the floor, demanding to be reinstated. But Mark calmly turned to her and said, you're welcome to stay as a homeowner. But you're no longer in charge here. The community has spoken. And, just like that, she was done. She sputtered, waved her papers, tried to yell over the crowd, but the crowd didn't listen. They talked over her, ignored her, and eventually, she stormed out. Again, that was the last time she ever came to a meeting. Over the next few months, things actually got better. Our new board focused on real issues instead of nitpicking. We fixed the streetlights. We set aside funds for resurfacing the pool. Even loosened a few of the ridiculous restrictions that had been strangling the neighborhood for years. Neighbors started showing up to meetings regularly, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They brought food, shared stories, laughed together. For the first time in a long time, it actually felt like a community. And me. I went back to doing what I'd been trying to do all along. Living my life, hosting my family, grilling in the backyard, watching the kids run around while the adults sipped lemonade and swapped stories. No fines, no threats. No ridiculous letters accusing me of too many guests. But every time I looked out at a full backyard, I couldn't help but laugh. Because in the end, the thing Karen tried to punish me for, the thing she claimed was destroying the neighborhood, was the very thing that saved it. Neighbors connecting, people gathering, guests, and the irony. Karen had once tried to use too many guests as a weapon against me. But in the end, it was her downfall. Because the night she lost control of the HOA was the night she was forced to sit in my yard, surrounded by more guests than she had ever imagined them. They weren't on her side. That's when I realized something important. HOAs, rules, fines, they only have power if people let them. The real power lies in neighbors standing together, refusing to be bullied. And remembering that community means more than control. So now, whenever I host a get-together, I look around my yard full of friends, family, and neighbors, and I can't help but grin. Because not only am I allowed to have guests, I once hosted the entire HOA on this very lawn. And trust me, that's a story nobody around here will ever forget. And that's how the HOA tried to fine me for too many guests, but ended up being the guests in my backyard instead. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about fighting fire with fire. It's about using their own rules to turn the tables, showing them they never had the power they thought they did. If you've ever had to deal with an HOA nightmare, just remember, you're not alone. And sometimes the best way to win is to make them play by the book they wrote themselves.